I need some traction. You need some traction.
Hey everyone, Lloyd Lobo here, co-founder at Boast AI and Traction Conf. This session is brought to you by Boast AI Launch Academy in partnership with Founder Institute, BCF Ventures, and Lazaridis Institute. I'm super stoked for today's session. One, because it's not talked about a lot, right? We're in the startup space. You're often talking about fundraising. You're talking about product. We're talking about growth. But one of the key things that enables all of this is people. And the best way to build a strong company is to build connection with your people. And I couldn't find a better person than Bev from Jostle. I highly, highly value her opinions and advice on the topic of how to build connection in your workplace. But at the end of the day, if you don't treat your people right, then your company is not going to grow. People are the key part of enabling your growth. If you talk to some of the fastest growing companies, the unicorns, the IPO tech startups, they'll tell you that people is core to their growth. And as younger companies, we tend to not focus on that or think about it deliberately. So I'm super excited for your session. Give us your backstory. How did you get into culture and people operations?
Yeah, thanks, Lloyd. So my background is in marketing and brand and communications, but I did study psychology and communications in my undergrad, and I've always been interested in how people come together to create work product or services or whatever it is that is the outcome of collective work in an organization. And so even though I pursued the marketing communications path, I always had sort of an eye on what was going on in other parts of the business. And in one of my positions in my career, about eight or 9 years ago, I had the opportunity to work on a project that let me collaborate with the VP of HR at the company that I was working for. And we basically rebranded the business, but we did it with a very people-centric orientation. And I started to dabble with this idea that brand is really everywhere in your business. It's not something that you just put in a logo and you then amplify that into the world. It really comes to life through your people. And so I started to pursue that more passionately and start to understand, well, how can I actually build my career around understanding what it makes, for people to have an excellent time at work, because that ultimately impacts how they show up for your brand. So that's my background. I now work for Jostle, who is a tech company here in Vancouver in Canada. And our product is an employee intranet. So we're thinking about ways that we can connect people into their workplaces and into their teams and with their leaders every day with our product. But at the same time, my job is to really explore and understand what's going on at work and what's changing for people at work. And that's why I have conversations on things like our podcast and in our Conversations at Work series to really hear what's going on in the world with academics, people who are on the front lines, people who are leading and building their own businesses, and employees who are actually experiencing what it feels like to be at work. And, the last 8 or 9 months have been an incredibly hard time for organizations and for culture in particular, as we all know. So it's been a really interesting time to be working in the people space. And I'm delighted to be here to talk a little bit more about what I feel is central to building culture and is more enduring than perhaps some of the other ways that people are tackling culture at the moment.
Awesome, Bev. Take it away.
Okay, fantastic. So our topic today is build connection, not culture in your business. And, as we've talked about in the intro, and thank you, Lloyd, for emphasizing that people really are central to organizations, and they are central to everything that you endeavor to do in your organization. And those organizations and leaders who realize and appreciate that are going to be the ones who in the long term are going to experience greater success for both themselves and their people. So I'd like to talk about an idea today around the fact that connection is actually what's important at work and not potentially overt efforts at building and shaping a culture. So let's jump right in. So when I think about this topic of culture, I like to think of it as the breakfast problem. And many of you might have heard the term that Peter Drucker, the management consultant, coined, that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And that may well be true, but the problem is that culture is really hard to build. We all know that. Many of us on the call today have been at the front lines of trying to build culture. And unfortunately, leaders often don't know how to do it, or they're focusing on the wrong things. And in the meantime, employees become disenchanted and culture becomes fragmented. And now more than ever, as we've been forced into this work from home experiment due to the pandemic, we've seen that if you didn't have a robust culture and a way to keep your people plugged into your culture before the pandemic, it's been really hard for people to stay part of your organization. People are becoming isolated, teams are struggling, work output is struggling. So it's really hard for organizations to keep people plugged in if they don't have a strong connection. And if you don't know how to go about building a robust culture, it's really, in my opinion, as good as missing breakfast. So what's interesting, though, is it's not that culture isn't valued. So there was a study done by the National Bureau of Economic Research that surveyed around 1,300 executives at North American companies. And 9 out of 10 of those executives believe that improving their culture would actually increase their firm's performance. So that's amazing, right? So over 90% of these executives really emphasize culture. But wait, there's something interesting in the data that we need to look at. And that is that only 16% of those people believe that their culture is where it should be. So here you have a group of people who understand that culture is important, but they don't know how to get there. And that's why we arrive at this scenario. Now, ping pong tables in and of themselves are not a problem in workplaces. What is the problem is when you as a leader are tempted to do the easy things, like install a foosball table or have the beer tap or the dogs at work or whatever these easy things are, like perks and gimmicks and perceived high value activities. So instead of doing nothing, companies spend time and money on the wrong things. And the real costs are actually felt with employees. So there's eroding trust, there's increased apathy, lowering engagement. I mean, we all know that employee engagement has been a struggle for decades. And employees quickly tire of these gimmicks and perks and these quick fixes. And they are pretty brilliant at seeing through engagement tactics that don't have any substance. So I believe the answer lies in connection. And if we think about humans and the things we need to feel safe and secure, it starts with connection. It's a basic human need. We strive to belong and feel secure. We do our best when we're surrounded by people who love and care for us, and we love and care for them in return. So it's no different in workplaces. We have that same need. We don't check this need at the door when we arrive at our workplace. And so if you're able to create that same kind of connection for your people, maybe not the same kind of love that you would feel for your spouse or your children, but if you can find a proxy for that in your workplace, you'll nurture all the key components of a healthy culture. So happy and engaged people, productive teams, unified goals, and a flourishing organization. So I really think that connection is culture. So, the simplest way to think about this is all of your rituals, your work habits, your processes, the way you socialize with your peers at work, the language that you use at work, and the liberties that you create for your employees are all created through connection. And that ultimately defines your culture. That's the character and personality of who you are as an organization. And coming back to what Lloyd said at the beginning, it really does start with people. And in my mind, there are 3 ways that we can create connection for people in the workplace. And I like to call these pathways of connection. And the three of them are people, purpose, and projects. So if we have a quick look at each of those, so people pathways are things like kinship and friendships at work, interaction, communication, support from those around you, up, down, and across the organization. So what are all the ways that people relate with one another in your workplace? And how does that actually feel for people? So that's the key distinction here, is like, it's the feeling part that we're trying to establish and maintain within an organization. The second pathway is purpose. So this is being part of something that's greater than yourself, or something that really has meaning. And for Gen Z in particular, and we know that by the end of 2020, Gen Z is projected to be a quarter of our workplace globally. So they are going to have a very, very important and prominent voice at work very soon. And it's very important for that generation to feel like they are doing something that aligns with their values and that is meaningful to them. So a key pathway to rally your people and to really build and deepen your culture is to have a very clear purpose that everyone can rally around. And then finally, I like to think of projects as a pathway, because the way that we work is an expression of our culture. It's how we come together to do the things that our business is there to do. So whether you make an object, or you offer a service, or you're in some kind of support industry like the medical field or the legal industry, those projects and the things that you work as part of an output are also an expression of your culture. And if you're providing stimulating, challenging, and meaningful work with highly functioning teams and the ability for individuals to grow professionally and personally, you are going to create a really strong connection within your organization. So as I mentioned, the character and the quality of these pathways, and maybe you emphasize one over the other in your organization, and that's okay. But whatever you choose to focus on, and perhaps you focus on all three, realize that they are interconnected, and they're unique for every organization. Now, a word of caution is that realize that if you're not intentionally attending to any of these pathways in your organization, your culture is growing whether you wanted to or not, and a different version of your culture is being shaped in the absence of attention to connection. So bear that in mind when you're thinking about your strategy for how you're going to nurture and build your culture. So let's have a look at a few examples of what I'm talking about in practice. And obviously there are many, many more examples. I picked these three because I feel that they're an interesting representation of each of those three pathways that I referenced. So Netflix really takes a people over process approach in their philosophy around building culture. And in their culture documents, and they're very explicit and very open about how they're building their culture, they really talk about emphasizing great people working together as a dream team. And everything they do across their organization is around connecting people into their business. So their connection pathway is most definitely people. The second example is Pixar. Pixar is led by Ed Catmull, and they've got a really fierce attention to building a culture around creativity. And they are building a culture that really helps people take risks and innovate. So if you know anything about culture, about Pixar, they're in the business of making beautiful, engaging animated movies. And creativity is absolutely required in their environment. So they are working at setting the highest standard possible for how you gain creative output from a group of people. And they emphasize psychological safety excessively in their organization. They want people to bring fresh ideas, bring ideas early. They want people to fail and to ask for advice or input early. So they very much are focused on purpose around what is the intent of culture, and how do you actually take that culture and express it through creativity. So a really interesting company. There's a lot written up about Ed and his leadership style there. So do Google that and read up about it, because it is really fascinating if you're interested in culture building. And then lastly, Google. So while I admit that Google campuses are known for their perks and gimmicks, and they've been the focus or the spoof of many a skit or movie, it's not really the gimmicks and the perks that define their culture. So they have a very strong team environment, which is made stronger by how they work together. And they really focus on working together rather than who is on the team. And they initiated 2 landmark research projects, Project Oxygen and Project Aristotle, which focused on understanding, first of all, in Project Oxygen, what makes a good manager, and then in Project Aristotle, what makes a highly functioning team. And they invested many months of time into understanding what actually makes up a good manager and what makes up a good team. So their culture is very much bound in how they work together. And so I like to think of them as the example of a company that is really looking at how work output and projects define who they are. Now, let's be clear, it's not all rainbows and sparkles and unicorns. As I said in the beginning, culture building is really hard, right? And you really have to invest the time to understand what drives your culture and how you can then build on that. And in my conversation with Lloyd in our podcast about the culture that he has built with his partner and his team at Boast, I'm sure Lloyd will attest to the fact that it hasn't always been easy. Even though the culture that they have there really helps people thrive, it hasn't been easy. And I can say the same at Jostle, even though we have a really healthy and vibrant culture where we emphasize co-creation and very much focus on the project side of things coupled with people as our pathway. It's hard, right? Whenever you have people involved, it's incredibly difficult to build culture. So I'm by no means here to suggest that magic thinking is going to help us overcome this problem, but I am here to provide some recommendations of how we can go about this, thinking about it through the connection lens. And today we're going to look at 2 ways of how we do that. And first of all, connection means humans first. So keeping humans at the heart of organizations is the first step towards building connected cultures. And then secondly, we need to focus on enablement. So it's one thing to define and understand what our connections are and our pathways are that we're going to focus on in our organization, but we have to enable people and we have to allow people to take action. And as leaders, we need to take those actions too. So let's have a look at what each of these look like. So when I say humans first, I just want to take us back to the beginning where I spoke about connection being a human need. So that is something that should stay front and center for leaders who are thinking about culture. Anytime we are dealing with people and including and involving people, we obviously know that people have different needs and people have different ways of engaging and being part of their culture. So humans first means that we have to be more intentional and more empathetic and more understanding about what our people need in an organization in order to feel connected. And that's complicated by people problems and people challenges that face us in organizations every day. And in particular, over the last few months, as we've been dealing with the pandemic, those issues have increased in many respects. I know some of us and many people that I've talked to are embracing what's come out of this pandemic as positive for their culture. But let's face it, it hasn't been easy, and there are some very real problems that are making it hard to keep people connected into their culture. And I'm going to look at 4 of those here today to help us understand what some of the challenges are that we have to overcome. The first of those is the rise of the individual. So I mentioned previously about how Gen Z is becoming a more prominent part of our demographic at work. But really, overall, I would say that there is more of an emphasis on individual needs at work than ever before. People have their own belief systems, their values that influence where they work, how they work, how they want to work. People have their own family needs or individual demands on their time that influence how they work or how they might be feeling at work on a given day. People have things that they want in their workspace or they don't want at work. So as leaders and culture builders, we have to be aware of what these individual needs are and how do we build a unified culture that is really based on, hundreds or thousands in some cases of individual demands. So very challenging problem. But if you can start by remembering that companies are made up of individuals, that's a huge step in the right direction. The second issue is increasing loneliness. So loneliness and isolation at work was already becoming a problem before the pandemic. Since many of us were forced into lockdown and some of us are still isolated, some of us might have returned to the workplace in some degree, maybe a couple times a week at work. But for the most part, many of us are still working at home. I know I am, and many of my peers still are too. So we do need to attend to the mental health impact of the pandemic. And not only the pandemic, but things that might be part of your organization that were causing loneliness to begin with. So problematic ways of communicating, toxic teams, bad managers. These are all things that increase loneliness for people and make them feel disconnected from the organization. The third issue is the urgency to respect differences. So over the last few months with the rise of the Black Lives Matter voice, as well as increasing urgency for us to look at systemic problems that influence discrimination or make it possible for stereotypes to exist within organizations. We really do need to attend to creating workplaces where people feel like they belong and where they are welcome and able to be who they are. It is no longer suitable for organizations to continue to build cultures where there are gender discrepancies, where there are pay inequalities. So leaders and executives in the workplace are going to have to deal with these issues before they can actually build healthy cultures where their people can thrive. And then lastly, remote work is here to stay. We've already seen many companies announce that they will be allowing their employees to work from home for forever. Microsoft is the latest to add their name to that list. I know that my company at Jostle, there is no urgency for our people to return back to the workplace. We've seen that we can actually be more productive and that we can actually enrich our culture by being in this strange remote work environment. So there's no need for us to go back to the office. We've all gained a lot in terms of productivity. Removing the commute is huge for people to regain time for themselves and for their families. So any leader who thinks that in a few months, everything will be back to the old normal is quite honestly fooling themselves. So when you're thinking about how you're building your culture and how you create connection, we're going to have to think about that as a multi-level strategy in terms of people who aren't in the office, people who are in the office, and how do we actually build those bridges and those connections in this quickly unfolding and changing work landscape. So those are some of the human elements that we have to think about. There are obviously more. This is not exhaustive. And I hope that, if you continue the conversation with me after this webinar, you'll be able to share some of your own ideas as well around what that looks like for your business. And finally, connection means enablement. So this is really about giving people the tools and the intention to be able to take action to build the culture. So this really starts with setting and embracing clear values that can be lived. So how you connect at work starts with your values. If you haven't taken the time to actually understand what those values are, I would really encourage you to do that, whether you're part of a leadership group or not. If you don't have any domain over this, I'd really encourage you to speak to your CEO or your direct boss and ask, why is there no time being spent on understanding what the values are of the organization? Because the values really do dictate the quality and the character of the connections that you're going to build within your organization. So if you have a clear idea of what your values are, that's a really good place for you to start living and enabling people to act in alignment with your values and what that looks like in practice. Secondly, this is a really important part of enablement, is establishing robust communication channels. So when you're thinking about how people connect within your organization, and especially if part or all of your organization is remote or dispersed, you're going to need to use some way of connection and communication for people to stay plugged in and in touch with one another. Now, using smart technology is the obvious way to do that. And using an intranet like the one that we use at Jostle is really a good place to start to create that go-to place for people to find all the things that matter to them in their workday. So people they need to work with, news they need to be aware of, things that are happening around the business, updates on projects, you name it. If you can create a go-to place for them to find that information, you are going to start from a very, very strong place. But you need to understand that there will be other channels that are specific to other needs in the business. So if you need to use Slack in a team because that's the best way for that team to communicate, go for it. If email is the best way for you to communicate, go for it. However, just remember that all the tools and the channels that you create need to work together, and they need to create simplicity and bring people together rather than creating more confusion and fragmentation within your organization. So the more clear you are here, the less overwhelmed people will feel and will have clarity of how they need to go about their day and connect with one another. Thirdly, you need to empower everyone to own your culture. Culture is not a top-down mandate from the CEO within an organization. It is something that is alive and will be strongest and most satisfying for everyone in the organization if every single person takes responsibility for it. And this is tied very much into your values in terms of people buying into and feeling like they identify with your values, first of all. But it's also connected to the communication channels that you create, because the more clear you can make those communication channels, the easier it is for people to actually be part of your culture. And you also need to set people free to contribute to your culture. If there are people who want to take responsibility for a portion of your culture, like running the social committee or having ad hoc teams that focus on things, or social groups. Maybe there's someone who wants to start a book club within your organization. Enable people and set them free to do that, because the more you can do that at the grassroots, the stronger your culture is going to be. And lastly, you need to be a connector yourself. So it's a bit of a cliche to say lead by example, but this really is true when it comes to building culture. So this does not mean that you need to be the top-down master champion of everything to do with culture in your organization. But you do need to live your values, and you do need to live according to the connection pathways that you have decided are suitable for building your culture, and also embrace the communication channels that you have in place. So if you have an intranet and you are the CEO, make sure that you are in front of people and engaging with people in a way that really helps them to live out the culture and see you doing the same thing. So I know that that's a lot for us to cover in a really short space of time, but there's some key ideas here that I think will be helpful for you to start thinking about how you're framing your culture, away from the perks and the gimmicks that may be prevalent in your culture right now. And really, if it feels overwhelming to you, and maybe it doesn't, you might actually have some of these things in play in your organization already. Just remember that it really just starts with one thing. You can spark connection anywhere in your organization. And you just have to start with one thing. So one conversation, one message to somebody that checks in on them, one new process, or one decision that is going to make you stay focused on a particular connection pathway in your organization. And secondly, sparking connection starts with being human always. So if you do nothing else but show up as a human being with all of the things that make you human, with all of the things that make you vulnerable as a person in your organization, that is a really huge step towards creating connection. Because if we go back to what we started with in this conversation, connection starts with humans. Culture starts with humans. So if you just bear this in mind when you are going about your business, that's really going to help you build a culture that is grounded in real human feelings and real human experience. And I do believe that culture will follow from that. You don't have to be intentional about having this strategy built out that you really believe you can execute in a certain amount of time. That's not what it's about. It's about being human and allowing the culture to unfold. So that's what I've had to share with you today. I continue to have these people-oriented conversations, and I'm a firm believer in people in the workplace, as I'm sure you've guessed. And the two places where I have those conversations, as we've already talked about before, are the podcast, which is People at Work, and then we have a bi-weekly conversation series, which is an open forum where we talk about the power of voice at work, which is called Conversations at Work. So do check both of those out and join us if you'd like to contribute to our community. So thank you, Lloyd. Appreciate the opportunity to talk about something that I'm really passionate about.
Bev, that was fantastic. I learned a ton. Some things we're doing already, some things we can definitely elevate based on your suggestions. Let's dive into some questions here. What is an example of a culture initiative that didn't quite work?
Yeah, so thanks, Lloyd. That's an interesting question. And I think just to preface my answer, I think it's important for people who are working at the forefront of building culture to try things and realize that some things won't work. And it's okay for that to happen because you learn from that. And I was recently chatting with someone on my podcast about an initiative that they launched. So their culture committee came together and they decided that they were going to run a baking contest in their organization. And so the idea was that everybody would bake some cupcakes and they would come together, and then there would be winners announced around, nicest looking cupcake, nicest tasting cupcake, etc. Which, that seems like a lovely idea, and they thought it would be a great way to bring people together. It would end in a social event where people would be eating all the cupcakes. Now, obviously, this was pre-pandemic, but the initiative actually fell flat. It absolutely tanked. And the reason was that suddenly people who couldn't bake, who were embarrassed to not be able to bake but would go out and buy something instead, felt that they couldn't bring something that they purchased from the store. There were people who just felt stressed because they didn't have the time, because they had family obligations or things outside of work. They didn't have the time to go and bake cupcakes for work. So they ended up with an event that completely failed because they didn't appreciate that this initiative, while lovely, actually created a lot of stress for their employees. So the learning here is to think about, when you have an idea, run the scenario of, how is that going to make people feel? Like, what else is happening outside of the work environment that might actually make this a very poor experience for people? So I'm sure there are many other examples of that. I know in my career, there have been things that I've done that I thought would help engage people, but that maybe missed the mark, right? Realizing that people have got lots of other things going on, even in their workday. Social events that I've planned where I've had poor turnout, and afterwards realizing, oh my goodness, the core team who was supposed to come to this social event actually had a big deadline at the end of the week, and they just didn't have the bandwidth to come to a social event. So those kinds of learnings are really key for us to think about the things we choose to do to help build our culture, because they can actually have a counter effect. So hopefully that gives our listeners here today just sort of triggers a little one step further thinking around the impact that your culture building initiative is going to have.
I think one of the most important things is, when you do an initiative, one, don't make it one and done, meaning there's no continuity. Like, we do these webinars, we're doing 2 webinars a week every week. Before, we were doing 1 every week. And I always say, when you start something, just make sure it continues and it doesn't stop. And also give people the option to opt in. So for example, you can't boil it down to just one baking contest, or force everyone to be a part of it, but rather try multiple initiatives, and just maybe have one initiative every other month and let people opt in. Like, we did a co-fit challenge for 6 weeks or whatever, and a handful of people opted in, right, to work out together every day. And it worked really well, and it was fun, and it was 15-20 minutes. And you don't penalize people who don't want to opt in, and they don't feel embarrassed and whatnot. And we do other activities like writing for a cause and whatnot. I think giving people the option to opt in is great, and also asking people to recommend their initiatives. You're building a community effectively, right? And it belongs to the community, so content should be generated from the community versus a committee.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, Lloyd. And understanding coming back to my point about the rise of the individual, right? People have different things they're interested in. And so if you can build events or initiatives or campaigns around catering to different people's interests and needs, that's a really smart way to proceed. Recently we had Wellness Week at Jostle, and it was a week-long event where we had a different day for a different part of wellness. So physical wellness, spiritual wellness, etc. And so we had activities and initiatives that were different on every day. So it really helped those people who, their default way to communicate is via chat. Gave them a chance to do that because that suits them. We had live events where those people who are more comfortable on Zoom or who don't mind putting their camera on were there. So I think that's the real key here is, meet people where they are, understand what people need in terms of their, first of all, the extent to which they need to engage. And, throughout this pandemic process, the introverts have been fine, right? The extroverts have really, really struggled, right? So understanding also what your demographic is made up of in terms of people's need to connect with people is also important, right? And not one size fits all in your approach. So yeah, just as far as you can, thinking about ways that you can have a variety of things that people can connect with. And having a social committee or a culture committee or some group of people in your organization that is leading the way with that is fine. But make sure that that team is representative of the variety of people and styles that you have within your organization as well. And I know that oftentimes that role defaults to HR or some admin function, and that isn't really the right way to go about it. It should be representative of everyone in your organization. So think about that as one of the mechanisms and your connection opportunities as well. How do you build a group of people who are leading the way for you, and is it representative?
That's a fantastic way to look at it. How do you convince a CEO that's data centric to be more people centric?
Yeah, that's interesting. I was just reading in the latest issue of the Harvard Business Review. There's a very interesting article on how we have over-engineered people management over, since the Industrial Revolution, basically. And what that's resulted in is the vast majority of CEOs are from an analytical background. So engineers, finance backgrounds, those types of very pragmatic process or results driven backgrounds, right? And that results in similar types of cultures. So we need to, first of all, break out of, what is the mold that we're using to create CEOs. That's the first step. But given that we're in the circumstance that we're in, where we do have a number of CEOs who are not people centric or people oriented as their point of departure, I would suggest that the CEO themselves needs to, first of all, become educated on the changing nature of culture in business. And that requires a great degree of self-awareness and willingness to change, and which in and of itself may not be that easy for some people. But I believe if there's an upswell from all parts of the business, a smart leader is going to be seeing those signals and will be thinking about ways that they have to change the way that they show up as a leader. I think it's also dependent on the senior leadership team that supports the CEO. I think they need to work together as a group, and there needs to be upward pressure from the senior leaders to the CEO with information that the CEO will actually hear. So speaking in the way that the CEO generally likes to think, but convincing them with evidence that building people-centric cultures has far greater value for the organization ultimately than taking an approach that is more system-oriented.
Great answer. How do you maintain connection with all the unknowns and uncertainty that's going on? A lot of people are going online. You talked about some of it. A lot of companies are enforcing online. A lot of companies are enforcing that their people come into work despite all the fears. How do you maintain connection with all this uncertainty going on?
Yeah, it's very hard. And, we at Jostle, we've lived that firsthand. We were not a remote company until March. Now we are a remote company and are for the foreseeable future. And we're lucky. We obviously use our own product extensively, so we connect, hourly on our own intranet. But there's still the connection piece, right? Like the technology in and of itself isn't going to solve that. It's the people that have to solve that connection piece, right? So, in the beginning, I think we saw a flurry of all sorts of things that people were doing. So online trivia games and the happy hours and the Zoom dinners and those sorts of things that did serve a purpose, and they were very successful, I think, in the beginning days. Um, Then as time went on, we started to feel Zoom fatigue, which is a very real thing. And it is definitely something that people are experiencing at the end of their days, having been on calls and video calls for most of their day. So my answer to this is once again going back to the people involved. So what do people need in this moment? And understanding as managers and team leaders what your individual employees are facing and struggling with is really critical right now, because just layering on the social gatherings, whether they're in person or on Zoom, isn't going to fix the connection problem. It's not going to satisfy people because you're not actually fulfilling or satisfying the core need of needing to feel heard and that you belong and that you're part of something. So finding ways to have one-on-one conversations. So I read the other day about an idea to have something called coffee roulette. So you put all your employees who are interested in participating into this little tool that then generates random matchups of one-on-one meetings for people every week. So every week you're matched up with a different person and you then have to have a coffee call with them just for 15 or 20 minutes, not to do with work. You just chat about what's going on, what you did on your weekend, what your dog's latest antics are, etc. So it helps people to have one-on-one connection that is not work-centric and that allows them to feel like they're part of something and that they're having those water cooler like conversations that we now don't have anymore, right? Like we don't have the knocking into someone in the hallway and saying hi when you arrive in the elevator anymore. So how do we, get the proxy for that? How do we simulate what that looks like using what we've got? And we're very fortunate. We've got technology. We've still got a lot working in our favor. It's just having the time to think about what's going to be meaningful for people. And again, not defaulting to those easy, quick things that we think will fix the problem. It's actually getting to the individual human and understanding what they need. And that really starts with the relationship between managers and their employees and understanding what people need in the moment. And that's going to change. So as a manager and a team lead, your work just got a lot harder, right? Because you can't just bark out instructions to people anymore. You've really got to understand what is going on in each person's life. And more so now, we're seeing into other people's lives, right? We're getting the backgrounds of their homes. We're seeing the children running behind them while they're on their calls. We're really, really feeling their pain when things aren't going well for them with all the other stuff that's going on. So, just really getting to the individual, I think, is the best way that I can answer your question, Lloyd, around accepting that we're disconnected, accepting that it is for the foreseeable future, but not feeling like you're powerless, because there really is a lot you can do if you start with the individual.
Definitely, and that is the best way to go, is start with the people. If you treat your people right, they treat your business right, and your business will grow. How do you initiate an unwilling team member into the company culture?
We've all had that that difficult conversation, right? Or maybe not a difficult conversation, but an awkward experience with that one person that is just completely uncoupled and disconnected and disinterested in being part of your culture. I've definitely experienced that, and as someone who works at building culture, I've found that to be frustrating in the past, but I've actually come around in my thinking about it. Just because someone is not vocalizing that they are a champion for your culture and is not there with their beer glass at every social gathering, doesn't mean that they're not a champion for your culture or that they are disengaged. So that's the first thing, is to actually identify whether they truly are disengaged or uncoupled from your culture. we have a few folks in my company who are very, very quiet. They go about their business. They do excellent work. They contribute to the culture through their work ethic and the way that they coach and mentor other people. So I celebrate that about them. I know that they're never going to come to the social gatherings or the holiday party or the very overt things that we do to come together as a group of people. But for those people who really are those curmudgeons that are just negative influencers and are really working against your culture, I would say approach them with empathy. So get to where they are as far as you can and ask them some questions. Approach them with curiosity and not with conflict. Understand why they might not be that eager to be part of your culture. Is there something that's going on that at home that makes them miserable in their day, which then trickles down into them being a negative influence in your workplace? So just if you can, as far as possible, treat them with respect. Don't make any assumptions about why they might be behaving the way that they are or not behaving in the way that you'd like them to. And just to try and approach them in a way that actually gives you some answers for why they are behaving that way. I mean, they might be a long-standing employee who has witnessed the growth of the organization, and they feel, disengaged because the company isn't like it was 10 years ago. So you'll be surprised if you can try and find the answer as to what might actually be causing them to be disengaged. So, and that's really a good way to approach anybody, right? Don't make assumptions, meet people where they are as far as you can, and approach everyone with an open mind and curiosity, I think is the best way to proceed.
There's this focus on grow, 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 grow. But if you're stepping on people to grow, then that's not very sustainable in the long term. You need to have people as a core to your DNA. Yeah, you can be an AI company, machine learning company, whatever. But at the end of the day, people are the core of making it all happen. And if you don't treat them right, it's just the emotional burden of swapping out people and the stress impacts your business in more ways than one. It's like I view everything like a relationship versus a transaction, and transactions are replaceable, relationships are not, and it takes years to build good relationships, and it's a lot of focus. You had a lot of great theory here. If somebody is new to all of this, what are the first steps they should do?
Yeah, I get asked that question a lot, and it's an important one because it's easy to feel powerless if you know what you need to do, but you don't know how to do it. And I think the first step is to understand what's going on in your organization currently. And depending on where you find yourself in the organization, that could be easy or difficult. But I would definitely advise listeners to go and take a look at what's going on in the organization at the moment. What are the habits around communication? What are the habits around doing projects together? What are the rituals around socialization? So get an understanding, first of all, of what's going on currently. Um, there may be things that are working perfectly fine that are serving your culture, but being able to tease apart the things that are not serving you from those that are is a next important step. And that happens through conversations, observations. That gets a little bit harder when we're all remote, if that's how your company is currently operating. But there's a lot you can observe, even over Zoom calls, around the level of connection that you're experiencing with people. And it shows up in different ways, right? It shows up in how smoothly projects are running. It shows up in attendance of voluntary events. So lots of things you can look for to try and understand what's your baseline. And then once you have that baseline, I would then take a look at what are your values. So go and refresh yourself on what the values are in your organization. Most of us have them in our organization. Some of us are more clear than others, but go and understand what those look like. And you might need to tweak them or reframe them a bit to help you have more impact with them as those guides for actions and behavior in your organization. And so once you've done that bit of homework, I think you can step into small changes. So for you personally, you also need to understand how you engage and connect with others in the workplace. What are you doing that is constructive or destructive? Be really critical of how you go about your day. How well are you listening to people? How well are you observing cues that people are in trouble? And what are you doing to help others in those situations? Um, Lloyd, you framed it beautifully earlier. You said, that companies are like communities, right? We're part of this community of people who have, there's character and personality, and it's made up of a group of individuals. So coming back to much of what I've said through this webinar is, if the only thing you do is get yourself down to the level of individual understanding, that is a huge step forward towards action. So, and the way that you do that is by asking questions, observing, being honest with yourself if you are in a senior leadership position about things that are not working in your culture, and then being committed to actually taking action. And that action could be as simple as, once a day, I'm going to send an email or send a DM to one person in the organization and say, hey, how are you doing? How can I help you? What's going on in your day? How connected are you feeling to the organization right now? If that's all you do, and you gather some insights and information about how people are actually feeling, that is a tremendous step down from the theory of what you need to do into acting, because you will find yourself making some pretty serious and probably flawed assumptions if you don't step into asking people how they're actually doing and what their experience of your culture is. So if that's all you do, have one conversation a day, that's amazing. If you feel like you can take on more, I would start to think about which of the pathways of connection resonate with your current culture most, and start to think about what is there in your organization that you have that can support that connection pathway, and what do you need to add to help you. So there's a ton of technology out there that can help us all be more connected. We know that we're overwhelmed by things every day that arrive in our email inbox that tells us that they're going to solve your connection problems. We all experienced that over the past few months. But if you really are clear on what it is you want to achieve, you can easily find a tool to help you do that. And just start somewhere. Like, you don't have to have it all solved before you actually begin. Just do one thing. Maybe you start a free trial of some tool. Try the Jostle intranet for 15 days if you want to. Something else that might help you, maybe it's Trello that helps you manage your projects better and gets people connecting and communicating better around your project work. Don't be afraid to try something new for fear that it might fail. It may fail, and that's okay. You've got a data point that you can use to help you craft your next suggestion for what might work. So I think ultimately, Lloyd, people just need to put themselves out there and be prepared to try new things, get down to the individual level, and be honest with themselves and be prepared to change and have self-awareness for themselves before they embark on anything else.
Back to that is like focus on people and ask that question, how can I make your life better? Right? What can I do, or what can we do as a company to make sure you're loving life and it's just not work, right? So I think that's a key thing you touched on.
One quick point there. It's one thing to ask and to be genuinely interested in what you can do to make someone's life better at work, but then you really need to take that and action it. Like, you need to think about what you can do. It's like doing an engagement survey and then not doing anything with the results that you get, right? So always think about asking, but then acting.
And that's why I don't believe in sending those blanket surveys. I believe in having the conversation, because you're talking one-on-one, and when you're surveying, like, people are not data points. People are relationships and emotions. And when you talk to them, and each leader makes a conscious effort to talk and understand the challenges people are facing or how you can make their lives better, you come up with ways to take action and work towards the end outcome. And maybe it's iterative, or maybe it's just a immediate switch, or maybe it's like something that you progress towards. But no is never an answer, right? It's like, okay, I want to work towards a promotion, or I want to work towards a certain salary, or I want to work towards some goal. Well, okay, let's work backwards from that. What are the gaps? What are your superpowers? What are the gaps to get there? And let's come up with a plan to get there, whatever it is. And no is never the right answer. When you shut the door on people, that's when they shut the door on you.
Yeah, I love that. There's a sort of a little structure that I use. It's not no, but it's yes and. Like that's the way to keep open-ended conversation flowing.
Yeah, it's not no, but it's yes, and let's do this together. I mean, the simple things like keeping that top of mind, yes, and let's get there, goes a long way. Just tonality and certain things you say that signal positive or negative emotions are key. This was fantastic. Lots of tactical stuff, lots of theory, lots to put into action. Thanks everyone for joining us. And also check out Bev's podcast on People at Work.
I need some traction.